Hey there. Tonight we're going back. Not to castles and kings, but to the edges of history. The part that doesn't make it into paintings. We're talking about medieval peasants. The ones who didn't ride horses or wear crowns. Who survived plagues, hunger, cold, and 100 small indignities, all without a title to their name. No glory, no legacy. Just long days, short nights, and a quiet kind of strength most of us wouldn't last a day in. If this kind of calm, slow history helps you unwind, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it actually brings you peace. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is right now. It's always strangely comforting to see who's out there falling asleep to the same quiet story. So, dim the lights. Turn on a fan if you like that soft background hum. Settle in and let's begin. At the edge of the map. This village doesn't have a name, or if it did, no one remembers it. It sits in a shallow valley somewhere in the vague middle of nowhere. A soft crease in the land, just distant enough to avoid roads, records, or royal attention. You wouldn't find it on a map. If you had a map, which you don't, you've never even seen one. Here, the world ends where the trees begin. The forest is thick and slow-moving, like something ancient that's only barely tolerating your presence. The fields stretch outward in irregular patches of green and brown, worked until exhaustion, then worked some more. Somewhere to the north is a river. You've never seen it, but you've heard it mentioned, in the same tone one might speak of dragons or saints. This is where you were born, and where you'll die. Maybe 60 steps from one to the other. The homes are rough and slumped, as if the wind has pushed against them too many winters in a row. The walls are wattle and daub, that is, mud, straw, and sticks, carefully woven together and patched endlessly with whatever the weather hasn't taken yet. Roofs are thatched, and they sag under their own weight, always leaking in places you can't quite reach. The village smells like wet wool, smoke, and earth. A sour edge of livestock. A trace of damp rot. None of it surprises you anymore. It's the smell of living here. The road leading in is not really a road, just a muddy track where ox carts have worn a pair of grooves deep enough to collect rainwater and mosquitoes. No one important has travelled it in years, perhaps ever. Most days pass quietly. A distant bell marks the hours from a chapel in another village, if the wind carries the sound. Otherwise you measure time by the position of the sun, or the depth of the shadows across the field, or the ache that settles into your spine before noon. There are maybe a dozen families here, enough to fill a small gathering on feast days. Everyone knows everyone. Everyone knows everyone's problems, and everyone politely ignores them until it's necessary not to. The village elder, if you can call him that, is a man named Tom, who once spoke to a monk, and now repeats that conversation as proof of his wisdom. No one questions it. Tom's hut hasn't collapsed. His goat seems healthy. That's as close to leadership as anyone requires. Nothing here is precise. There are no written records, no deeds, no land surveys. Boundaries are understood in terms of past the old elm, or where the ground gets soft. If there's a dispute, it's handled with a shrug, a short argument, and sometimes a loaf of bread passed back and forth until no one wants to keep fighting. There's no school, no tavern, no inn. If a stranger arrives, it's discussed for weeks. Where did they come from? What do they want? Are they cursed? Do they smell of salt? The arrival of someone new is both fascinating and mildly terrifying. And no one leaves. Not really. The idea of travel is less a plan than a rumour. You've heard of towns, of cities, of places where stone buildings stretch 2 or even 3 stories high. But those are stories. Like talking animals or women who turn into birds. You can't miss a world you've never seen. The forest is dense. The hills are long. The roads, if they exist, are known more for bandits and bad luck than any promise of arrival. What would you do, even if you reached one of those distant places? You don't speak any other dialect. You don't carry coin. You don't know the customs. You don't even know how old you are. So you stay. There's safety in the familiar, even if it's hard, even if it's dull, even if the roof leaks and the well runs low and the same stew has been bubbling in the pot for 3 days. There's comfort in routine, in knowing where the firewood is, in knowing who to ask when your fence collapses, in knowing which patch of sky tells you when to bring in the sheep. You wake with the light. You sleep when it fades. You work in between. It isn't much, but it's life. And somehow, in the quiet rhythm of it all, there's a kind of peace. A kind that doesn't ask questions, that doesn't need to understand anything beyond what's visible from the top of the nearest hill. You might hear, once in a while, about a war, or a king dying, or a comet in the sky that scared a village 5 days' walk from here. But the news never seems to reach you directly. Just stories passed through too many mouths to carry weight. They lose their urgency somewhere between the merchant and the shepherd's cousin. Even time feels different here. Seasons don't shift cleanly. They bleed into each other. A damp spring becomes a wet summer. A hard frost turns into the kind of winter that chews through your boots. You don't count years. You count harvests, dry ones, wet ones. The bad one when the rye grew black with rot. The good one where the barley came in thick and heavy, and even old Marjorie smiled for a week. His steward does. He collects grain, asks questions, writes things down. You answer carefully, never with too much detail. He doesn't seem to like detail. You've never met the king. You're not entirely sure what he does, but you know his name, and you say it when you pray, just in case it matters. Because here, on the edge of the map, most things don't change, and when they do, it's usually for the worse. Still the hearth glows. The roof mostly holds. The pottage is warm. And tomorrow the same sun will rise over the same hills. And for now, that's enough. In your lifetime, you'll walk hundreds of miles, but almost all of them will be in circles. Most people in the medieval countryside never travelled more than a few miles from where they were born. Not because they lacked curiosity, or energy, or boots, though boots were often a luxury, but because the world beyond the next hill didn't really belong to them, and the idea of going to find it, that felt as far-fetched as flying. You grew up learning the names of every patch of land between your home and the edge of the field. You knew the shape of every tree stump on the path to the well. You could tell who had walked the road by the depth of their footprints in the mud. Everything beyond that started to feel theoretical. The next village over might only be 5 miles away, but it may as well have been a foreign country. You'd heard stories about it. Who married who stole a goat, who said the priest snored during Mass. But you hadn't seen it, and you likely wouldn't, because travel was dangerous. Not in the fun, thrilling way. In the quiet, exhausting, possibly fatal kind of way. Roads weren't well-kept paths lined with signs and travellers' inns. They were mostly muddy tracks through forests, fields, and long stretches of very empty, very silent land. No maps, no directions. Just vague advice like, go until you see the leaning pine tree, then left past the stone that looks like a sleeping pig. And on those paths there were things to worry about. First, the forest. Medieval forests weren't parks. They weren't romantic. They were dense, dark, tangled with roots, and filled with noises you couldn't always identify. Boars, wolves, people who didn't want to be found. If you weren't born into the woods, they didn't want you in them. Second, bandits. People with nothing to lose and no land to till. Travellers were vulnerable, especially if they looked even vaguely well fed. A man walking with purpose might be assumed to have coin. A woman might be travelling alone because she had something worth stealing. You learned quickly that confidence wasn't armour. Third, getting lost. This wasn't a minor inconvenience. If you wandered off track, there was no one coming to find you. You couldn't follow a river downstream and hope for the fest. You could go days without seeing another soul. Your body could disappear into the bracken like smoke. People wouldn't know you were missing until the next feast day, when someone finally asked about you, and someone else just shrugged. Then there were the practical concerns. If you travelled too far, who would tend your field? Who would feed the animals? What if the Lord Steward came by to collect a tax while you were gone? You couldn't explain absence to a man holding a ledger. Your duties didn't pause just because you were curious about what lay beyond the horizon. And even if you did make it to another village, what then? You weren't expected. You weren't welcomed. Outsiders brought problems, disease, crime, strange ideas. You spoke a slightly different dialect, used different phrases, maybe even held your spoon differently. You could be met with suspicion, or worse. Hospitality wasn't universal. Food was scarce, and beds were already full. The safest place was home. Not because it was particularly safe, but because it was familiar. You knew which part of the roof leaked, which chickens wandered too far, which neighbour might lend you a tool without asking too many questions. Out there, no one owed you anything. Still, people did travel sometimes. Not peasants usually, but merchants, monks, messengers. People with protection, or a purpose, or both. You might see them once or twice a year, coming through with carts full of wool or salted fish, trailing stories behind them like campfire smoke. They spoke of cities where buildings were made of stone, and shops sold spices, and people walked streets that didn't turn to soup every time it rained. It sounded impossible. You listened, but you didn't dream too hard. Because even if it were true, what would you do in a place like that? You couldn't read. You didn't own coin. You wouldn't know which customs were expected. The city could swallow you whole, and no one would even know your name. So you stayed. Not because you were afraid, though sometimes you were, but because you had things to tend, a fence to mend, a niece to watch over, a bit of barley to dry, and a dozen other tasks that all needed doing before the sun dipped below the tree line. And because, truthfully, you didn't need the world to be bigger than it was. The village was enough. It had gossip and conflict and weather and sickness and fleeting joys. It had the rhythm of bells and the turning of seasons and the quiet pride of surviving another day. Sometimes you dreamed of seeing what was beyond the woods. But most days you just hoped the stew wouldn't burn while you fetched water. The village was enough. It had gossip and conflict and weather and sickness and fleeting joys. It had the rhythm of bells and the turning of seasons and the quiet pride of surviving another day. Sometimes you dreamed of seeing what was beyond the woods, but most days you just hoped the stew wouldn't burn while you fetched water. Some people did leave, usually the desperate or the reckless, sometimes the ambitious. A young man might set out in search of work, or adventure, or a cause worth dying for. He might come back with a limp, or a story, or not at all. And when he didn't return, no one said much. Just shook their heads and said, "He went beyond the trees," as if that explained everything. Maybe it did. For those who stayed, life was small, but it was also known. You weren't lonely exactly. You shared your days with family, neighbours, animals, and the land itself. There was comfort in repetition, comfort in the familiar complaints. You didn't need to see a distant city to understand the value of warmth, or taste cinnamon to know the joy of sweet bread, or cross a kingdom to feel love or sorrow or boredom or hope. And as the years wore on, and the aches settled deeper into your joints, and the children grew taller than the fence posts, the idea of travel faded. Not with regret, but with understanding. Some people were meant to move. You were meant to stay. There is no blueprint, no architect, no pile of neatly labelled lumber waiting to be assembled. Just mud and wood and whatever else the landscape hasn't already claimed. Your home isn't a house, not in the way most people think of one. It's more like a compromise between shelter and weather, between effort and decay, between what you needed and what the land reluctantly agreed to give you. You begin with the frame, rough-hewn timbers from the nearest trees, cut with tools that have passed through more hands than you can count. The wood isn't straight. It bends a little, it warps. But you don't mind. Neither are your walls. Once the frame is up, you weave thin branches or flexible sticks between the posts, a process called wattle. It's not elegant. It's not even particularly quick, but it holds together, for the most part, like the rest of your life. Then comes the daub, a mix of mud, straw, manure, and water. You slap it on by hand, you press it between the gaps. You smooth it just enough to keep the wind out and pretend it's deliberate. It dries slowly, cracking in the sun, occasionally falling off in clumps that need to be redone before winter. You get used to the smell. Eventually, you stop noticing it. The roof is thatch, layers of dried straw packed tightly together and tied to the beams. When it's fresh, it's golden, almost pretty. Then the rains come. Then the birds come. Then time comes. The colour fades. The edges fray. Holes appear where you never expected them, and you start placing buckets in places you hoped you'd never have to. You don't shingle it. You don't waterproof it. You just keep patching it until the whole thing threatens to become more patched than roof. At some point, you wonder if it might be easier to live under a cart. The floor is dirt. You tell yourself it's packed firm. And it is, sort of. Years of walking, sweeping, spilling, and stomping have turned it into something almost solid. But when it rains, it softens again. When it freezes, it cracks. When the goats come in for the night, it's anyone's guess what's actually underfoot. You might spread rushes or straw to cover it. It helps, a little. But soon the straw gets damp, gets dirty, gets walked into dust. Then you sweep it out and start over. Or you don't. Eventually, the straw becomes the floor, and you accept it as part of the landscape. Windows, technically. Openings in the wall, anyway. Covered with wooden shutters that swing awkwardly and never quite close flush. Glass is too expensive, too rare, too fragile. So the wind comes in. The cold comes in. The sounds of the animals outside come in. And sometimes the animals themselves. There's a single door, usually hung a little crooked, because the frame shifted during the last frost. It latches with a hook or a wooden peg. Not for security, there's nothing to steal, but to keep the chickens from wandering out and the wind from wandering in. Inside, the layout is best described as shared. One room, maybe two, if someone managed to tack on a lean-to or a loft, but usually just one, where you sleep, eat, cook, mend, talk, argue and hope. Everyone lives here. Parents, children, a cousin or two, a grandparent, maybe a neighbour's child whose parents are sick, or gone, or both. There's a hearth in the centre, built of stone if you're lucky, clay if you're not. The smoke rises through a hole in the roof. More or less, there's no chimney. The air inside is always smoky, always a little warm, a little damp, and always carrying the quiet scent of stew that's been reheated one too many times. Furniture is limited. A table, a bench, maybe a stool, a chest, if someone in your family was unusually good at carving or very lucky in marriage. Beds are wooden frames stuffed with straw or feathers, often shared, usually squeaking. Blankets are wool, heavy, rough, never quite dry. There's storage in the rafters, garlic, onions, herbs, maybe a small ham if the pig was kind that year. You can smell the difference between early winter and late spring just by the air above your head. Sometimes it's comforting. Sometimes it's a reminder of how close you are to running out. Animals are part of the household, literally. The cow might sleep in the same room, off in the corner. Chickens too. A goat. It isn't ideal. It isn't sanitary. But it's warm. You learn to tune out the clucks and the shuffles and the occasional startled bleat in the middle of the night. They're part of the background noise, like wind in the thatch or the slow settling creak of the walls. Nothing is level. The floor dips, the roof slants, the walls bulge slightly like the whole place is breathing in and out with the seasons. You fix what you can. You ignore what you can't. Every spring, you swear you'll repair the back wall. Every autumn, it's still leaning. It's not a house built to last. It's a house built to get through the next storm. And yet, for all its flaws, and there are many, it's home. You know where the cold comes in and how to block it with an old sack. You know which roof beam you can hang the pot from, and which one creaks when someone stands too close. You know how the light falls through the slats in the afternoon, and where the dog curls up to sleep. When strangers pass through, they see poverty. You see effort, reuse, resourcefulness. A roof that hasn't yet collapsed is a victory. A fire that still burns at dawn is a blessing. A dry corner is worth more than gold. And when you lie down at the end of the day, surrounded by snores and silence and smoke and straw, you feel a strange kind of comfort. Not pride exactly, but presence. This is your space. It bends. It leaks. It shifts in the wind. But it's held. And so have you. For the average medieval peasant, food was not an experience. It wasn't colourful or diverse, or even all that warm. It was closer to a daily problem that had to be solved again and again. using the same pieces and the same tired hope that something edible might come of it. Your kitchen, if you could call it that, was a corner of your single-room home near the hearth. There was no pantry, no shelves lined with ingredients, no carefully hung herbs in a sunny window. There was just a pot, a fire, and a short list of things you hoped hadn't spoiled. At the centre of nearly every meal was pottage, a kind of eternal stew that lived in the pot and never fully stopped cooking. It was never entirely new and never entirely gone. You added to it during the day. You skimmed it at night. You kept it warm through the seasons and prayed nothing strange grew in it when your back was turned. The ingredients depended on what you had, which usually wasn't much. On a good day, pottage might include cabbage, leeks, barley, and a few legumes. Maybe garlic or onions if the harvest had been kind. If it was winter, you used dried beans or peas. If you were especially lucky, a scrap of salted pork might get tossed in. More often, it was just the bone. Even that was valuable. You could boil a single bone for days, hoping it would remember what meat tasted like. The flavour profile was consistent, earthy, grey, more temperature than taste. You didn't eat pottage for the joy of it. You ate it because it was what you had. A warm meal at the end of the day was more than comfort. It was a small victory. The pot itself never really got clean. It was wiped down, sometimes scraped, but rarely scrubbed. The next batch always absorbed the ghosts of the last one. There was no spice to cover it, no vinegar to brighten it. Just a slow, dependable dullness. A taste like boiled history. Bread was the other major player, not soft or golden or inviting, but hard, dense and dark. It was usually made from rye, barley or oats. Wheat, the soft white kind, was for the upper classes. Peasants could barely afford to see it, let alone bake with it. The loaves were small and heavy. They didn't rise much. They crumbled quickly. If you left them out for a day, they could probably double as a weapon, but they filled the stomach and gave you something to soak in your stew. Sometimes the bread was made from questionable flours, chaff, ground up peas, or whatever was left at the bottom of the miller's barrel. In hard times, people used bark, not metaphorically. They literally ground up the inner layer of tree bark and mixed it with what little flour they had. The result was famine bread, bitter, dense, and barely digestible. It kept you alive, technically. On days when even flour was scarce, people used trenchers, slices of old bread used as plates. These soaked up stew and were either eaten at the end of the meal or thrown to the animals. Sometimes they were passed down the table to someone of lower status. Bread hierarchy at its finest. Protein was rare, very rare. Chickens laid eggs. Cows gave milk. You didn't eat your livestock unless you had no other choice. When you did, you used every part: meat, fat, organs, bones. The blood was used for puddings. The fat was rendered. The head might become soup. Nothing was wasted. Pork was the most common meat when it was available. Pigs were efficient, and their salted fat flavoured many dishes, often turning something barely edible into something vaguely pleasant. But pigs were slaughtered only when necessary. A whole pig meant weeks of planning, salting, hanging, boiling, and storing. Fishing was an option if you lived near water, but even that came with restrictions. Many rivers and lakes were controlled by lords, and a fishing without permission could earn you a fine or worse. When you did fish, it was for eels, small river fish, or anything that wouldn't immediately rot. Salted herring, if you could get it, was a prize. The church dictated a fair bit of your diet too. On Fridays and during Lent, meat was forbidden, so you pivoted to fish or went without. In more creative times, beaver tails were classified as fish, a theological workaround that few questioned because it meant having something to eat. Milk was common, but also fragile. You had to use it quickly or turn it into cheese or butter. Butter was a luxury in some homes, used sparingly. Cheese was harder, tangier, and often quite dry. If you had a few good rounds stored away, it meant the cow had been generous that year. Dairy, though useful, didn't always agree with people, and refrigeration didn't exist. Sour milk was used anyway. Butter went rancid, cheese moulded. You just cut around the worst bits and hoped your stomach was stronger than the bacteria. Drinks were simple. Water was unreliable, often unsafe to drink, depending on the season and what upstream neighbour had been careless. So, ale was the default. Weak ale, known as small beer, was brewed in homes and drunk by everyone, including children. It had low alcohol, just enough to kill bacteria and dull the edges of thirst. If you had access to apples or pears, you might make cider. Wine was for the clergy and nobility. Mead was rare. Milk was for the young and the sick. Otherwise, it was ale with breakfast, ale with lunch, and ale to help forget that tomorrow would taste exactly like today. Vegetables formed the bulk of your diet. Cabbage, onions, garlic, turnips, leeks. Carrots, though not the orange ones we know now. Medieval carrots were white or purple. Most were grown in small gardens, tended carefully and eaten root to leaf. Nothing was wasted. The tops of turnips might be boiled into greens. The skins were composted or tossed into the fire. Fruit was seasonal. Apples, mostly. Maybe some berries or wild plums. If you dried them, they lasted through winter. Otherwise, they were eaten fast. Preserving was difficult. Sugar was nearly impossible to afford. Honey, if you had bees, was a treasured sweetener. Otherwise, your pottage stayed savoury, in the loosest sense of the word. Herbs were grown when possible. Parsley, sage, dill, mint. They weren't used for flavour so much as medicine or tradition. Some herbs were thought to protect against illness. Others kept pests away. Occasionally, they even made things taste a little better. But that was a happy accident, not the goal. Meals were eaten together, on benches, around the fire. There were no courses, no recipes, just a pot, a hunk of bread, and the hope that there would still be something left tomorrow. You didn't complain. Complaining didn't make the stew thicker. If you had a feast, a wedding, a harvest festival, a saint's day, you might roast a bird or bake a pie. Not the flaky, buttery kind. A medieval pie was more like a sealed box, made of hard dough to hold a meat filling, often heavily spiced if spices were available, which they usually weren't. You might flavour it with pepper, ginger, or cinnamon, if someone had traded well. Most days weren't feast days. Most days were quiet. You scraped your bowl, you soaked your bread, you drank your ale, and you leaned back, full enough to get through the evening, if not exactly satisfied. There was comfort in repetition, in knowing what the pot would taste like, in knowing how much bread was left, in watching the same hands prepare the same meal by the same fire as the wind whispered through the cracks in the wall, and the animals shifted in their sleep. The stew boiled, the bread cooled, and you once again had enough. If you were a medieval peasant, you didn't own much. You might have a patch of land, a few tools, a couple of animals, a crooked house you built with your own hands. But none of it, technically, was yours. It all belonged to the Lord, not a king, not someone mythical or distant, just your local landholder, the one who lived up the hill in a slightly less crooked house, with slightly better food, and a roof that probably didn't leak. He owned the land, which meant he owned everything on it, including, in a sense, you. You were what was called a villain. That's not an insult. It's a category. You worked the land, but you didn't own it. You were bound to it. You couldn't leave without permission. You couldn't pass it on freely. You owed labour, goods, and deference. You weren't a slave, but you weren't exactly free either. Your relationship with the Lord wasn't built on conversation. It was built on obligation. You didn't talk to him. You talked to the steward, the man who managed his lands, and more importantly, kept track of what everyone owed, and you owed a lot. Let's start with labour. A few days a week, sometimes more during harvest. You were expected to work the Lord's fields instead of your own. This was called corvée labour. You got nothing for it, no payment, no thanks. Just the knowledge that, somewhere in the manor house, someone ate because of what you did. You also owed taxes, and they came in many shapes. A portion of your grain, a share of your wool, a chicken here, some eggs there. If you brewed ale, you owed ale. If you had a pig, you owed bacon. If you managed to catch fish, guess who owned the river? The taxes didn't end with food. If you used the mill, you paid a fee, even though the mill was the only way to grind your grain, even though the Lord owned the mill and set the price. You might be tempted to grind it by hand, but doing so was often illegal, punishable by fine or worse. Because the Lord didn't just want his share, he wanted control. Same with the oven. Many manors had a communal oven, one you paid to use. If you tried baking at home and the steward found out, there could be consequences. You learned to do things the official way, even if it took longer, cost more, and made less sense. And then there were the fees. Want to get married? Pay a fee. Want to inherit your father's plot? There's a fee. Want to move to another village? First, ask permission. Then, you guessed it, pay a fee. Your livestock. Taxed. Your tools. Sometimes taxed. Your ability to breed without permission. Barely untaxed. And what did you get in return? Well, the Lord was supposed to protect you, in theory. If bandits attacked, or if a rival noble invaded, the Lord had men at arms who could fight. If famine struck, he might distribute grain from his stores, though rarely for free. And if you had a legal dispute, say, your neighbour's goat wandered into your garden and refused to leave, the Lord's court might settle it. Again, not for free. This was feudalism, a system of obligations and hierarchy wrapped in the language of loyalty and protection. In practice, it was a system of ownership. The land was everything. Those who owned it ruled. Those who worked it obeyed. The manor itself stood apart from the village, sometimes literally on higher ground. It might be made of stone or timber, larger than any peasant's home, with a roof thatched so thick no wind dared enter. Inside were tapestries, tables, servants, and the Lord, of course, wearing wool lined with fur, eating meals you couldn't imagine, and thinking very little about you. He might not know your name, but he knew your numbers. How much barley you owed this year. How many eggs you'd promised. Whether your son had reached the age where he could be added to the labour rolls. Everything was recorded. Not by you couldn't read, but by the steward, the reeve, the bailiff. Men with wax tablets or bits of parchment who came around with questions you learned to answer carefully. And if you didn't meet your obligations, there were punishments. Fines, usually, more goods taken, days added to your labour. In extreme cases, your tools could be confiscated, or your land reclaimed, or your house, your goats, your dignity, all of it, gone. You didn't resist. Resistance wasn't rebellion. It was foolishness. But here's the strange part. The system worked. Not because it was fair, but because it was stable. It had rules, predictable if harsh. You knew what you owed. You knew what was expected. There was no guessing, no sudden surprises. Just a steady, grinding rhythm of give, give, give. And occasionally, just occasionally, the Lord would give something back. A feast day where food was distributed. A holiday where labour was waived. A kind word, perhaps, spoken from horseback. Not enough to balance the scales, but enough to keep things from tipping. The relationship was never friendly, but it was enduring. Your lord might be young or old, kind or cruel, present or distant, but he was always above. You didn't question that. You bowed when he passed. You removed your cap. You used the right words, not because he deserved it, but because you didn't want trouble. And maybe, deep down, because a small part of you still hoped that one day you might be noticed, rewarded, lifted, even just a little. It almost never happened, but that's how the system stayed alive. Not just with fear, but with the faintest suggestion of hope, that if you worked hard enough, obeyed long enough, prayed loud enough, something might change. Meanwhile, the steward kept walking, the reeve kept writing, the mill kept grinding, and you kept digging your hands into the soil, year after year, season after season. There was no retirement, no bonus, no upward mobility, only the quiet knowledge that you had fulfilled your role. You had done what was asked. You had made it through another year under the weight of someone else's title. And as long as the Lord was pleased, you were allowed to go on living. Long before the Black Death swept across Europe and etched itself into history books, medieval peasants were already well acquainted with sickness. Not the kind of illness that came and went with the seasons, though there was plenty of that too, but the slow, constant presence of something always waiting to go wrong. Infection, fever, wasting, swelling, coughing. Disease wasn't an event. It was a feature of life. You didn't need a continent-wide catastrophe to be laid low. All it took was a small cut, a single flea, a bit of water that looked clear but wasn't. And unlike weather or taxes, illness didn't follow rules. It arrived without warning, and it rarely left quietly. There were no hospitals. Not really. If you were lucky, your village had a wise woman, maybe a midwife, someone who knew which herbs to boil and which ones to burn. If you were extremely lucky, there might be a monk nearby, literate, well-meaning, and slightly more effective than random prayer. But for the most part, when you got sick, you stayed home. You lay in bed, you sweated through your shirt, and you hoped. Most people didn't understand what caused disease. The word germ hadn't been invented yet. Microscopes were centuries away. What you had were theories, old ones, confusing ones, and often wrong ones. Some believed in miasma, bad air that carried disease through smell. If a village reeked of rot, manure and smoke, it was assumed to be dangerous, which, in a way, was correct, but not for the reasons people thought. To combat the bad air, People stuffed herbs into their clothes, carried flowers in their sleeves, or walked around with vinegar-soaked rags pressed to their faces. Not pleasant, not helpful, but deeply believed. Others blamed divine punishment. Illness came from sin, from impure thoughts, disobedient acts, or general moral decay. If your child fell ill, it was a test. If your crops failed and then your body failed, it was probably your fault. Or your neighbours, or both. There were local traditions too. Some thought illness came from the evil eye, a glare from someone jealous or angry. Others blamed moon phases, animal spirits, or grumpy saints. One particularly popular explanation was that sickness entered the body through the soles of the feet. The solution? Boil them. And if that didn't work, burn something nearby. Possibly your mattress. The cures were as strange as the causes. If you had a fever, you might be bled. A local man would arrive with a blade, a bowl, and more confidence than training. Sometimes leeches were used, sometimes sharp stones. The idea was to balance your humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If they were out of sync, so were you. No one ever saw these humours, of course, but they were blamed for nearly everything. For swelling, there were poultices, smears of mashed herbs, mud, or even bread, wrapped in cloth and tied to the body. Some worked, most didn't. A few made things worse. But the important thing was that something was being done. If your stomach ached, you might chew on charcoal. If you coughed blood, you might drink wine mixed with crushed pearls. If your eyes blurred, someone might whisper a prayer while blowing smoke over your head. If your leg turned black, you were probably out of options. And then there were the plague amulets, bits of metal or bone worn around the neck, sometimes inscribed with protective words, sometimes blessed by a priest. Some people buried onions in the corners of their homes. Others hung garlic above the door. One popular remedy was to tie a live chicken to the infected area and hope the illness transferred to the bird. It rarely did, but hope was in short supply, and people clung to whatever they could. Sickness was isolating, but not in the way we think of now. You didn't quarantine, you didn't call for help, you just tried to work until you couldn't. When that moment came, you lay down, and others carried on. Children were fed, animals were fed, you were given broth maybe, and a few murmured prayers. Sometimes illness passed. The fever broke. The swelling went down. You walked again, slowly, with a new limp and a deeper respect for warm soup. Other times it didn't, and your family lit a candle. Plague, in the broader sense, wasn't always the dramatic kind that left bodies in carts. More often, it was a slow infection, skin turning dark, limbs swelling, a cough deep enough to rattle the walls. Smallpox, leprosy, dysentery. Even the flu could sweep through a village and leave half the population in bed. There were no case numbers, no charts, just stories. A traveller from another village said the cough had started there last week, or someone heard that 3 children had died near the river. You paid attention. You started boiling more water. You left herbs under the door. You kept your distance, even if no one said why. Death was not always feared, but it was recognised. People knew when it was near. They knew the signs. Breathing that slowed, skin that cooled, eyes that turned dull. There were prayers for the dying, soft ones, whispered by firelight. When the Black Death finally did arrive in the 14th century, It hit with a violence that dwarfed everything before it. But by then, the world was already familiar with sickness. The idea that you could be well in the morning and gone by night was not new. It was just happening more often. The plague came in waves, and each time it returned stronger, stranger. Buboes swelling in the neck and groin. Fever that stole the mind. Blood that darkened and bubbled. People died in days, sometimes in hours. Entire villages vanished. Fields went untilled. Bells rang too often. Some peasants tried to flee, but disease travels faster than feet. Others turned to religion, doubling their prayers, whipping their backs, promising to live better if they were spared. A few turned to violence, blaming outsiders, blaming sinners, blaming anyone but the wind. The church offered explanations and comfort and burial. Monks died in droves. Priests vanished. In some places, death became so common that the funerals were skipped. Bodies were buried in mass graves, often without names. And yet, life continued. People learned how to survive around sickness. They accepted it the way they accepted hunger or cold, not joyfully, but with a kind of tired resilience. They cleaned their homes more often. They shared herbs. They whispered new prayers. Some believed that surviving one sickness gave them protection against the next. Others didn't believe at all, but they got up anyway and milked the cow. Children grew up learning which plants to avoid, which ones to chew, and which ones to boil until they stopped smelling like feet. They knew how to wrap a wound, how to wait out a fever, how to tell when someone wasn't going to get better, and when you should stop hoping. And through it all, they didn't stop living. They married, they harvested, they shared meals, such as they were. They sat by the fire and retold stories of the last illness and the time someone's grandfather survived a winter fever with nothing but garlic water and stubbornness. Plague wasn't the end of the world. It was just another part of it. And for those who endured, survival became its own kind of resistance. A quiet, stubborn refusal to go quietly. A belief that tomorrow would come. And if it didn't, someone else would remember your name. Or at least the way you always added rosemary to the broth. Night in the medieval countryside wasn't peaceful. It was silent in the way a cave is silent. Full of creaks, distant sounds, and the kind of quiet that makes you notice how loudly your own body exists. The day ended when the light failed, and everything that wasn't already put away had to be dealt with quickly. Because once darkness fell, the world shrank to the size of your hearth. There was no artificial light, no candles burning freely into the night. Wax was too valuable. If you had a tallow lamp, it was reserved for emergencies or religious devotions. Most nights, the fire dimmed, the coals glowed softly, and that was all. And so you slept. But not in the way we think of sleep. Not in a single, unbroken stretch. Sleep in the Middle Ages came in 2 acts. First sleep, then a waking period, and finally a second sleep. This rhythm wasn't accidental. It was how people adapted to the long, lightless hours between dusk and dawn. You would drift into your first sleep not long after nightfall. The fire would be banked, the animals would have quieted, children would be hushed. The home, 1 room, maybe 2, would stretch out into stillness. If you had a mattress, it was stuffed with straw or feathers, possibly lumpy, often shared. If you didn't, you slept on woven rushes or directly on the earth, softened only by habit. Everyone slept together. Family, relatives, even servants. All in one shared space. Not out of closeness, but out of necessity. It was the only warm room in the house. On the coldest nights, even animals were brought inside. A goat near the door, a dog curled by the hearth, chickens in a basket. Warmth was more important than boundaries. There was no privacy. The idea of sleeping alone was associated with punishment, not comfort. The rich might afford solitude. Everyone else just made do. You turned to face the wall. You stuffed straw in your ears. You shared blankets. You breathed in each other's breath. And if someone snored, and someone always did, you got used to it. First, sleep lasted a few hours. Then, almost like clockwork, people would wake. It wasn't disturbing. It was expected. During this time, often around midnight, the world was still and quiet. Some people prayed. Others stirred the coals. Some used the chamber pot or stepped outside into the freezing air. Some reflected. Others whispered. It was a time of dreams too, vivid ones. People believed this midnight space opened a thin veil between the living and the dead, between the sacred and the mundane. If you dreamed during this waking interval, you remembered it, and you talked about it the next morning, not in passing, but as something that mattered. Eventually, the second sleep began, deeper, slower. This was the sleep that healed, or tried to. It was when the aches faded slightly, when the day's blisters cooled. If you were lucky, it was uninterrupted. If you weren't, you simply lay still and waited for dawn to give you an excuse to rise. The home didn't go silent at night, not entirely. The fire crackled. Wind whispered through the thatch. A baby might fuss. A cow might shuffle its hooves. Sometimes the night was broken by coughing, the wet, rattling kind that never seemed to end. And everyone noticed, but no one said anything. It was understood. The fear of the dark was real, and not irrational. The night carried real dangers, both imagined and entirely physical. Wolves, for instance. In some regions, their howls came close enough to the village to raise hairs on the back of your neck. They weren't just creatures of legend, they were real, and hungry. Then there were thieves, rogues, strangers, fires that started from a careless coal, roofs that groaned under snow, and less explainable things. Ghosts, spirits, demons, witches. You didn't talk about them openly, but you knew they were out there. To protect the household, you followed rituals. You placed iron by the door, made the sign of the cross above the hearth, whispered protective blessings over the straw mattress, hung herbs, rosemary, sage, rue, above entryways. Sometimes you tied a bit of string around a child's wrist, just in case. Even with protection, some families believed that sleep left you vulnerable, that the soul wandered while the body rested. So people tucked in carefully, covered mirrors, faced the bed toward the fire, avoided sleeping with their feet pointed toward the door. The cold was its own enemy. It seeped through walls, through thatch, through poorly sealed doors. People didn't sleep under mounds of blankets. They layered wool, fur, cloaks, tunics. The idea of undressing for bed would have seemed absurd. You slept in your clothes, sometimes in your boots. There was a comfort to sleeping next to others, but also discomfort. Someone always shifted. Someone always murmured. There were elbows, knees, the occasional surprise from the family dog. But this was normal. You didn't expect silence. You expected closeness. And in that closeness, you found a strange kind of security. You heard your father breathe, your child twitch, your grandmother mutter a prayer in her sleep. It wasn't peaceful, but it was human. It was shared. When you dreamed, your dreams mattered. A field of wheat might mean prosperity. A snake, illness. A broken tooth could mean death. You learned to interpret these things. Or you found someone who could. The village had dream readers. Not officially, but everyone knew who to ask. The church had its own ideas. It warned that some dreams were from the devil, that sleep was a time when temptation could slip in. You were told to pray before bed, to avoid certain thoughts, to keep your soul ready in case the night was your last. Because it could be. People went to sleep and didn't wake up. Illness could take hold while you rested. A fever could rise. A cough could deepen. And by morning, someone might be gone. Quietly, as if stolen. This uncertainty gave every morning a slightly reverent tone. When the light returned, and the rooster cried out, and the coals were stirred back to life, it meant you'd survived again. You sat up slowly. Every joint reminded you of your age, no matter how young you were. The cold bit your nose. You wiped your face. You looked around and counted bodies. Everyone who stirred was accounted for. Everyone who didn't was checked on. And then, once the living were confirmed, the day began. Water was fetched, bread was prepared, animals were fed. The dream you had, if it was important, was shared. And the memory of the night faded, not erased, just softened, folded into the next stretch of time. In winter, sleep came early and stayed late. In summer, it shortened. But the rhythm remained. First sleep, a waking hour. Second sleep, a world without clocks, but not without routine. And for all its discomfort, there was something grounding in that rhythm. Something honest. You didn't aim for comfort. You aimed for endurance. And if you happened to find rest along the way, a moment of warmth, a particularly quiet night, a dream that didn't leave you afraid, that was a gift. One you didn't question. One you didn't expect again too soon. Some years you're simply hungry. Other years you're in a famine. It's not the same. Hunger is manageable. It has rules. You stretch food. You ration. You hope. But famine breaks the rules. It's when the fields fail, the root cellar is bare, and there's no more pretending that next week will be better. It's when food becomes an idea more than a substance. In a medieval village, you often saw it coming. It started in the spring. Too much rain, or none. The barley came up patchy. The beans flowered, then browned. The cabbages cracked open too early. The wheat heads stayed stunted, bowed like they were already mourning something. You noticed. Everyone did. At first no one said it. But the looks were exchanged. The calculations made. Quietly. Internally. How much is left from last year? How much seed can we keep? How much can we afford to eat? The answers were never good. The hardest part was knowing what to do next. Not in winter, but in summer. Because that's when you had to choose between planting the seeds or grinding them into flour. Between saving for a harvest that might never come, or feeding your child one more bowl of something warm. And so the portions began to shrink. The stew got thinner. The bread got smaller. The bowls didn't come back empty. They just came back less often. You didn't panic. Not yet. You told yourself this happened once before, or that another village might have extra, or that the manor stores could fill in the gaps. Hope was still on the table, just not much else. By August, it became harder to ignore. By September, it became impossible. You stopped feeding the animals first. Chickens were quiet. The goat's bleating grew hollow. The dog, if you had one, stopped barking and started following you more closely, like it understood it was next. Bread became ritual. One loaf split 5 ways. Everyone chewed slower. No one commented on the crust. Even the smallest crumb was swept up with reverence. The stew was now mostly water. If it had colour, it was from the pot. You boiled weeds. You ground roots. You pulled up things you didn't recognise and hoped they weren't poisonous. Some weren't. You didn't sleep through the night. Not because you were afraid, but because your stomach reminded you, every few hours, that it was still empty. The children asked fewer questions. That's how you knew it was real. They didn't ask when the bread was coming. They didn't ask for honey. They didn't beg for stories. They sat close to the fire and stared. They learned how to wait. And your neighbours? You stopped seeing them outside. The village quieted. No more laughter in the lane. No more arguments about sheep. Just the occasional cough or crack of firewood. Famine didn't make people cruel. It made them silent. Sometimes someone would bring back a rabbit, or a bird, or a handful of acorns that could be soaked and ground. You chewed them even when they still tasted bitter. You smiled anyway. Not because it tasted good, but because it was something. You tried not to resent the manner. Sometimes they gave grain. Sometimes they didn't. The steward came around less. That was good and bad. Good, because he wasn't there to take anything. Bad, because he wasn't there to help either. His silence said more than words ever could. The church did what it could. Bread after mass. Alms for the poorest. But they too were stretched. You prayed more. Not out of faith, but out of repetition. Words are easy when your hands are too tired to do anything else. Some left the village entirely, packed up and wandered to find work or food or God. Some returned. Some didn't. You never asked what happened. You were too tired. The body changes in famine. You feel your ribs first, not from the outside, but from within, like they're too close to your skin. You stand up slower. You bruise easier. You wake up with your hands clenched, like they're still gripping tools you can't afford to use anymore. And the cold hurts more. The fire is your best friend. You spend more time tending it than you ever did cooking on it. You sit close. You sleep facing it. You feed it even as your belly goes empty. Because heat is the one luxury you can still provide. By now you've eaten everything that could be eaten. The roots, the weeds, the dried beans, the stale flour. You've boiled bones 3 times over. You've soaked bark. You've baked famine bread that cracked your tooth. And when the food was gone, you looked to the things that weren't food, but might become food in the right light. Leather, boiled and salted. Not delicious. Not satisfying, but technically chewable. You found a rat once. You didn't scream. You thanked God. Then you hid it. Cooked it alone, told no one. You still feel guilty. But you don't regret it. The dreams become strange. You dream of feasts. Tables full of roast and bread and wine. You wake up chewing your tongue. You dream of boiling things over and over, even though you haven't boiled anything in 3 days. You dream of animals coming back, of green shoots breaking through snow. You dream of your childhood, when hunger was simpler, and some nights you dream of being full. You wake from those crying. The graveyard grew slowly at first, then quickly, then too quickly to keep up. You knew someone had died when the church bell didn't ring. It meant there weren't enough hands to lift the rope. The grave was shallow. The prayer was short. The mourning was silent. Everyone had their own hunger to manage. You wanted to mourn, but you couldn't afford the emotion. You held it back, like everything else. Then, like every famine, it ended. Not suddenly, but steadily. Rain came, and it stayed. The ground softened. Seeds germinated. Plants reached up, weak but real. You had enough energy to hope again. You saved the first harvest for others. Children first. Elders next. You took the smallest bowl. You smiled as you passed it. And when the first good loaf came out of the oven, cracked on top, dark on the bottom, you stared at it before you ate. You remembered every day you went without, every trick you used, every lie you told to spare someone else. You ate slowly, and this time it filled you. By the time you could walk, the church had already marked you. It had taken your name at baptism, blessed your breath with Latin you'd never understand, and stitched your soul into a system that extended far beyond your village. You belonged to the church not because you chose to, but because there wasn't another option. In the quiet corners of your life, those dim early mornings before the fire had caught, those wet nights when the wind howled through the shutters, you felt its presence like gravity. It didn't just exist beside your life. It organised it, judged it, taxed it, forgave it, and defined what came after it. The church wasn't a place you visited. It was the air around you, the road beneath your feet, the rhythm of your year. It was the voice that murmured over your grave, and the one that whispered about it decades before you got there. The village priest, often the only person who could read, was not just your confessor. He was also your calendar, your counsellor, and the nearest thing to an oracle you had. He held the mysteries of the sky and the stories of the saints, and knew why a pig might die or a storm might come. He walked through the village like a man carrying both blessing and threat in his robes. You brought your sins to him in whispers, hoping he wouldn't look disappointed. You tried not to think about what he knew. You saw him at birth, marriage, and death, three of the only guaranteed ceremonies of a peasant's life. And in between, he spoke for a God you feared more than you loved, because love, you were told, required obedience. Latin was the language of the Mass, and it might as well have been a spell. You stood in the church beside your family, feet numb from cold, listening to words that never belonged to you. You didn't know what the priest said as he lifted the bread, but you believed, or tried to, that something invisible had happened. That the bread wasn't bread, that the wine wasn't wine, that the murmuring of words and gestures could move the divine. You didn't speak the words, but they moved through you anyway. You mouthed along where you could. You crossed yourself when the others did. You learned the rhythm of holiness like someone learns the path to a well, without understanding every step, only that you needed it. The church told you when to fast and when to feast. It carved the year into sacred pieces. Lent, Advent, Epiphany, All Saints. You didn't say March or April. You said after Easter or near St. Michael's. It told you what you could eat, when you could eat it, and how guilty you should feel about enjoying it. 40 days without meat before Easter, followed by a feast so rich it made you dizzy. Friday fish, even if you lived nowhere near water. Almond milk for the wealthy. Turnips and cold broth for everyone else. On saint days, you shared what you could. On fast days, you imagined what you couldn't. But even when your bowl was empty, your plate was full of rules. Your calendar wasn't just for prayer. It was also for payment. The church collected 1/10 of your yield, no matter the season. Grain, eggs, wool, chickens, cider. If it came from your field or your body, it had a price. You gave because it was God's portion. That's what you were told. But God didn't collect it. The priest did. Or the steward, with his ledgers and his silent nods. You watched your best barley carted off to the tithe barn, which was always bigger than your home. You saw your neighbours hand over their last sack of oats, while the priest prayed for mercy they'd just paid for. And when the harvest failed, when the rains came too late, or the frost too early, the demand didn't change. You owed what you owed. Sometimes they let you pay in candles or labour. Sometimes they didn't. Sometimes the debt grew so heavy it bent your back even when you stood upright. But the church didn't just take. It gave too, though not always in the way you wanted. It gave stories. It gave structure. It gave reasons. When your cow died without cause, the priest told you which saint to pray to. When your child fell ill, he told you it might be a test or a punishment or the devil slipping in through a crack in your belief. He offered blessings and sacraments, told you to light a candle or visit a shrine. Sometimes he gave you a scrap of relic, an old bone, a tooth, a ribbon soaked in some forgotten martyr's blood. You held it like treasure. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. But even when it didn't, it was better than nothing. There were saints for everything. Saint Apollonia for teeth, Saint Isidore for ploughing, Saint Sebastian for plague. You didn't know where they were buried or when they lived. You only knew their names and what they could fix. Their stories were half memory, half magic, told in flickering firelight by people who weren't sure where truth ended and legend began. You called on them when you had nothing else. You whispered their names as you stirred the pot or knelt in the field. You made deals with them, promised bread or fasting, or a pilgrimage if only they'd help you this once. Sometimes they did, or seemed to, and that was enough to ask again. Pilgrimage was a holy journey, but also a way to leave. For a few days, you stepped outside the same 5 miles you'd lived your entire life. You walked roads you didn't know, toward shrines you'd only heard of. You carried your prayers with you, strapped to your back, clutched in your hands. You slept under hedges or in the corners of barns. You arrived footsore and raw, stood before a bone or a statue, and hoped something would shift inside you. Sometimes it did. You returned not healed, but changed, or at least tired enough to believe you had been. Even death was a ritual choreographed by the church. When you felt it near, you sent for the priest. He came with oil and words. He touched your forehead, prayed over your body, tried to ease your soul into what came next. Your family gathered. The candles were lit. The bell might ring if someone had the strength. You were buried on sacred ground, beside others who had walked the same path. And then came the masses. Your family lit more candles, paid for prayers, hoped the priest remembered your name in his chants. Because even in death, there were debts. The church taught that your soul might not go straight to heaven. It might linger in purgatory, a shadowed hallway between suffering and salvation. You could wait there for years, or centuries, or longer, unless someone helped, unless someone prayed, paid, lit enough candles, said your name often enough to pull you through. And so your family paid what they could. The poor gave bread, the rich gave land, all to shorten a stay in a place no one had seen, but everyone feared. Because fear too was part of the church's gift. The church explained the world when no one else could. It told you why the rains failed, why your child didn't wake, why illness took the young and spared the cruel. It told you that suffering had purpose, that obedience had reward. It gave you structure in the middle of chaos, and that structure, even when it burdened you, gave you peace. Not comfort, always, but peace. You never questioned the church's power. Not seriously, not out loud. You might grumble about the tithe or curse when the priest looked the other way, but you never stopped showing up. You didn't stop kneeling. You didn't stop crossing yourself when the bell rang. Because if the church wasn't right, then the world had no shape at all. And a world with no shape was a terrifying thing. Even when the priest drank too much, even when the bishop demanded too many taxes, even when the indulgent seller passed through town with a cart full of promises and a purse full of coins, you still believed, or you acted like you did, which, in the end, was mostly the same, because belief was less about what you thought than what you did. You didn't understand the Latin, but you understood the structure. You stayed inside it because it was the only way forward. And when you died, you hoped the bells would ring, and the candles would burn, and your name would be said often enough to matter. You hoped the saints still listened. You hoped your sins had been counted and forgiven in equal measure. You hoped the church, in all its weight and mystery and dust and gold, would carry you the rest of the way. You might think that after everything they endured, after the famines and plagues, after the tithes and taxes and the heavy boot of the manor's authority, peasants would have risen up more often, that the weight of centuries of suffering would have built up until it cracked the walls of their villages, until one cold morning the frost would thaw and something inside them would snap. You might think they would have gathered in fields and marketplaces, tools in hand and fire in their hearts, shouting that they would kneel no longer. But they didn't. Not often, not for long, and never all at once. There were revolts, yes, the Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381, the Jacquerie in France a few decades earlier. Small uprisings scattered across Europe like stones thrown into a still pond. Angry voices in places where the lords had taken too much, pushed too hard, taxed one coin too many. Sometimes the spark caught. A tax collector's house burned. A steward run out of town. A banner lifted. But those fires burned fast and were snuffed out even faster. They ended in executions, in gallows built in village squares, in silence heavier than the one that came before. The world didn't change. The grain still had to be sown. To understand why peasants didn't revolt more, you have to stop thinking of them as naive or cowardly. They weren't. They were survivors. Not of single tragedies, but of unbroken hardship, sustained year after year. They lived in a world of low ceilings, where hope was something rationed like grain. They didn't lack courage, they lacked margin. In a life where every day was spent just trying to keep the roof patched and the soup warm, there was no space left for rebellion. You could plan a revolt, or you could dig potatoes. You couldn't do both. The truth was, the system worked. Not because it was just all kind or efficient, but because it was ancient. It had sunk its roots into the habits of generations. It didn't need to be explained. It simply was. You owed labour. You owed grain. You owed the church its tenth, and the Lord his harvest. You owed a quiet nod when the reeve passed your door. You were born into that owing, and unless you were exceptionally lucky, you died in it too. But by staying within those bounds, you could survive. Barely, yes, but you could. The cost of stepping outside those rules was too high. The manor had soldiers, the church had excommunication. The king had no idea you existed, but he had laws that still bound you like rope. The penalty for defiance wasn't always death. Sometimes it was worse. Banishment, starvation. Your family left to carry the debt you tried to escape. Everyone had heard a story. A father taken. A mother whipped. A cousin who disappeared after refusing to pay. The stories were passed down not to stir rebellion, but to prevent it. Besides, rebellion often didn't feel like an option, because the people you lived beside were not strangers. They were your kin, your neighbours. You shared fields, tools, fences and prayers. Even if you hated the steward, you might still marry his daughter. Even if you resented the tithe, you still brought bread to mass. The village wasn't a place you could leave easily, nor was it one you could tear apart without tearing yourself apart in the process. To revolt against the manor was, in some small way, to revolt against the rhythms of your own life. It's easy, centuries later, to imagine the peasant as a figure of eternal submission, head bowed, hat in hand. But this picture misses the complexity of their world. Submission wasn't servitude, it was negotiation. Most peasants did not simply suffer. They adapted, they bartered, they bent. They found cracks in the walls and made homes in the spaces between the rules. A pig kept off the ledger, an extra sack of rye buried in the earth, a bribe given in eggs rather than coin. These were the rebellions they could afford. They were practical people. Their world was not governed by ideology, but by weather. The question was not what is just, but will this feed us through winter? And justice, if it ever came, was a luxury they didn't trust. Lords changed, priests were replaced, rules shifted, but the wind still blew, the soil still needed turning, and children still cried from hunger. You didn't revolt against that. You endured it. The church played its part too, and perhaps more effectively than the sword. It taught that suffering was holy, that endurance was righteous, that the meek would inherit the earth, though it never said when. You were taught that your trials were not punishment, but purification, that your obedience would be rewarded not in this life, but in the next. And if the promise of heaven wasn't enough, the threat of hell filled in the rest. Fire, torment, gnashing of teeth, all waiting for the proud, the rebellious, the ones who said no. And yet, the peasants were not passive. Their resistance was just quieter. They gossiped about the steward. They sang rude songs about the Lord's habits. They laughed when the priest stumbled on a sermon. They told stories at night of better days and better men. They found dignity in the smallest acts, a shared crust, a well-timed silence, a field tended just a little differently than the rule book said. Their rebellion was in the way they survived, despite it all. Not because they accepted the system, but because they made it bend just enough to let them breathe. Sometimes, of course, things changed. A lord died and his son was kinder. A new bishop forgave debts. A terrible storm reminded the powerful that even they were mortal. But those changes came from above. The peasant's job was to wait, to endure, to hand down what little they had, and to teach their children to be quiet when they had to be, and brave when they could be. And there were dreams. Of course there were. You might not have called it revolution, but you thought about a different life. You dreamed of a day when your child wouldn't have to carry the same burdens, when no one would knock on your door with a list of dues, when your back wouldn't ache before 30, when you could sleep without worrying about wolves or soldiers or winter. Those dreams kept you going, but they lived beside reality. You didn't expect them to come true. You just needed them to stay alive. What's perhaps most astonishing is not that peasants revolted so rarely, but that they managed to keep their culture, their faith, their families intact despite the weight of the system pressing down on them. They kept songs alive that no one wrote down. They passed stories from one hearth to the next. They remembered which plants healed and which ones didn't. They taught one another how to pray, how to birth children, how to bury the dead. They created a continuity that outlasted kings and crusades. And they did it not with banners or battles, but with persistence. Persistence was their rebellion. When the manna demanded too much, they survived anyway. When the church taxed their sins, they still lit candles. When the world turned against them, they huddled close and waited for spring. The fields may have belonged to someone else, but the soil still remembered their hands. Revolution didn't live in them the way it would in later centuries, in the speeches of radicals or the slogans of crowds. But there was a different kind of strength in the way they endured. To live a life of hardship without letting it harden you completely was its own kind of defiance. To kneel, not because you were weak, but because you knew you could rise again tomorrow. That too was a form of resistance. And so they endured, quietly, without monuments or songs written in their names. They endured in the rhythm of the plough, in the smoke rising from cottages at dusk, in the lullabies sung beside dying fires. They endured in stories whispered to children who would grow up and tell them again. History often forgets them, or folds them into a footnote beneath kings and conquests. But the peasants were the thread that held the tapestry together. Without them, there would have been no harvests, no cathedrals, no armies to march under banners. They built the world even as they were kept from owning it. They may not have overturned their lords, but they outlasted them. And maybe that is revolution enough.